The statues on Rapa Nui aren't just monuments to the past. They are the remains of a system that once dominated the entire island. For centuries, the people here carved massive stone figures to honor their ancestors and dragged them across the landscape, using ropes, wood, and hundreds of workers. Each statue required timber, food, and labor. Over time, those demands stopped being symbolic and became logistical. The statues weren't simply expressions of belief anymore. They became a machine that consumed resources faster than the island could replace them. Before we continue, this channel covers what history did to human bodies and systems, not myths. Comment where you're watching from. If this is worth your time, like and subscribe. There was no invasion and no sudden disaster. The collapse didn't arrive with fire or warships. Instead, it came quietly, through arithmetic. Fewer trees meant fewer boats. Fewer boats meant less fishing. Less fishing meant hunger. On a small island, thousands of miles from any mainland, there was nowhere else to go. This wasn't a mystery or a curse. It was a closed system, slowly exhausting itself. What followed wasn't dramatic at first. It was gradual, mechanical, and irreversible. An island that fed itself for centuries eventually began feeding on its own future. When the first Polynesian settlers arrived around 1200 AD, the island was densely forested and rich with life. Giant palms covered the hillsides, seabirds nested along the cliffs, and the surrounding waters provided deep-sea fish. Timber was abundant, which meant strong houses, reliable fires, and large canoes capable of traveling miles offshore. For generations, food was relatively easy to secure, and the population grew steadily. During this period of stability, clans began carving the moai. At first, the statues were modest, but competition between groups pushed them to grow larger and more elaborate. Some eventually stood over 30 feet tall and weighed dozens of tons. Transporting them required extensive preparation, cutting trees for rollers and sleds, weaving ropes from plant fibers, and feeding hundreds of workers for days at a time. Every statue demanded wood. Every new project cleared another stretch of forest. The work never stopped, and neither did the cutting. At the time, it didn't look dangerous. There were always more trees farther inland. The island still felt large, but the rate of consumption quietly exceeded the rate of recovery, and the forest began to thin. The consequences showed up slowly, not as catastrophe, but as decline. With fewer large trees available, building ocean-going canoes became harder. Fishing trips grew shorter and less productive. Archaeological waste piles show the change clearly. Large tuna bones disappear first, followed by medium fish until only small coastal species and shellfish remain. The deep ocean, once a major food source, was no longer accessible. Deforestation also destabilized the soil. Without roots to hold it together, rain washed fertile earth into the sea, and wind stripped the ground bare. Crop yields fell. Seabird populations declined as nesting sites vanished. The variety of food narrowed year by year. People compensated by working longer hours and inventing new methods of farming, covering fields with stones to trap moisture and protect the soil. These rock gardens were effective, but labor-intensive. They allowed survival, not abundance. At the same time, rats that had arrived with the first settlers spread across the island, consuming palm seeds and preventing the forest from regenerating. Even if people stopped cutting entirely, the trees would not return. The damage had become permanent. The system no longer had a way to rebuild what it had lost. By the 17th century, the last large trees were gone. Without timber, there were no strong boats, and without boats, there was no deep-sea fishing. The island became effectively sealed. The ocean stopped being a source of food and became a barrier. From that point forward, everything had to come from the land, and the land was already exhausted. Food grew scarce, meals became smaller, labor demands stayed the same. People grew thinner and weaker, while competition over farmland intensified. Skeletal remains from this period show increased injuries, fractures, blunt trauma, and weapon wounds, evidence of frequent conflict. Raids on gardens became common, and when the gardens were empty, the diet changed again. Thousands of obsidian spear points, mata'a, appear in the soil layers from this era. They weren't designed for hunting animals. There were no animals left. The moai, once symbols of status and protection, began to feel like reminders of misplaced effort. Communities that had invested generations of labor into raising them now struggled to feed themselves. In that environment, faith in the old system collapsed. Clans began toppling each other's statues in the Huri Moai, dragging the massive stones down with ropes and leaving them shattered on the ground. The monuments weren't destroyed out of ritual. They were pulled down because they no longer made sense in a world defined by scarcity. By the time European ships arrived in 1722, the island was already under strain, treeless, wind-scoured, and dependent on fragile agriculture. The society still functioned, but only just. Then outside, forces accelerated the decline. In 1862, Peruvian slave ships began raiding the island. Around 1,500 people, nearly half the population, were kidnapped and sold into forced labor. Many of those taken were leaders and knowledge keepers. Most died quickly from disease and overwork. When a small number of survivors were eventually returned, they brought smallpox with them. The disease spread rapidly through a population already weakened by malnutrition and stress. Within a few years, entire families disappeared. Skills and traditions were lost. By 1877, only 111 Rapa Nui remained alive. The collapse of Rapa Nui wasn't mystical or sudden. It followed a chain of simple cause and effect. Trees were converted into monuments and tools. Fewer trees meant fewer boats. Fewer boats meant less fishing. Less food meant hunger. Hunger meant conflict. Conflict weakened the society. When slavery and disease arrived, there was no resilience left. It wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a slow, cumulative failure of an isolated system that consumed more than it could replace. Over time, the margin for survival disappeared. Today, the moai still stand across the landscape, facing inland over empty fields and bare hills. They aren't symbols of mystery or legend. They are evidence, stone records of a society that pushed its environment beyond its limits and paid the cost over generations. The people weren't defeated by a single enemy. They simply reached a point where the island could no longer sustain them. An isolated world, finite resources, and a system that demanded more than it could ever give back. If you want more documentaries about how civilizations rise, fail, and survive under pressure, subscribe for the next story.